Coming up on Arirang News, the Korean government approves a third extra budget to help the economy recover from the coronavirus pandemic and its impact. It's the country's biggest extra budget to date at around $29 billion. Almost 1.8 million South Korean grade school students head back to the classroom. Some schools are still closed, but more than 3/4 of Korean students are now able to attend in person. And the Pentagon agrees to a proposal from Seoul that the South Korean Defense Ministry start paying the thousands of local workers furloughed from their jobs at U.S. military bases. It's 5:00 p.m. here in Seoul. Thank you for joining us on Arirang News. I'm Devin Whiting. South Korea reported 49 new cases of COVID-19 on Wednesday amid continued cluster infections in Seoul and the surrounding area. All but 3 of them were local transmissions. Of those, 19 in Seoul, 12 in Gyeonggi-do Province, and 17 in Incheon. The total number of cases is now 11,590. There was 1 new death, bringing the total death toll to 273. Nearly 28,000 people are currently being tested. With concerns about kids going back to school, the Prime Minister pointed out that of the 70 students infected in May, none caught the virus at school. In fact, another 1.8 million South Korean grade school students returned to the classroom today, though some schools are still closed because of the outbreak. These students are in the first year of high school, second year of middle school, and third to fourth year of elementary school. And that means 77% of the country's students are now able to go to class in person. There are still 519 schools still shut, though, most of them near a logistics center in the city of Bucheon, where there's a cluster infection. At those schools, only high school seniors are going to class until next Wednesday. South Korea is going to raise the status of the Korea Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, making it into an agency independent from the Health Ministry. The Ministry of the Interior and Safety said Wednesday that the necessary legislation is awaiting the National Assembly's approval. The revision is in line with recent remarks from President Moon, in which he praised the KCDC for its efforts in controlling the pandemic. The government says this should strengthen the KCDC's expertise in combating diseases. The roughly 4,000 South Koreans who work for U.S. Forces Korea can look forward to getting paid soon, after about 2 months on furlough. The U.S. Department of Defense has accepted a proposal from Seoul that the South Korean government provide money for their salaries and wages. They were put on unpaid leave in April when the Allies' defense cost-sharing agreement expired. In a statement Tuesday, the Pentagon said this will enable South Korea to provide more than $200 million for them through the end of the year. It added that the USFK expects all of the employees to return to work no later than mid-June. Seoul's defense ministry said it welcomed the decision and will try to promptly reach a deal on defense cost-sharing. The South Korean government has approved a third supplementary budget to get the country through the economic slowdown caused by the coronavirus pandemic. It's worth around $29 billion. In a meeting Wednesday led by Prime Minister Chung Se-kyun, the cabinet signed off on the budget plan, the largest in Korean history.
We will focus on injecting emergency funds into key industries and small enterprises while keeping and creating jobs. Through the supplementary budget, we will work to accelerate both consumption and investment and also help exports recover.
The government will submit the budget proposal to the National Assembly on Thursday. If the proposal is approved by lawmakers, the government plans to spend more than 75% of it within 3 months. Now, that budget will be used to boost the economy, to fight the virus, and much more. But it's not all new funding. Much of it's being moved from existing plans for spending. Our Kim Da-mi explains.
It's the largest extra budget in South Korea's history. The $29 billion super budget is even bigger than those allocated during the Asian financial crisis in 1998 and the global financial crisis in 2008. And it's the first time in almost half a century that South Korea has allocated a third extra budget in a single year.
The government aid is needed for businesses and small firms to overcome the crisis. This financial pump will create a virtuous cycle of financial recovery and contribute to the national economy.
The $29 billion supplementary budget comes from reallocating over $8 billion of spending from other purposes, issuing $19.6 billion of state bonds, as well as using money from 8 local funds. The latest supplementary budget also draws from some of the country's defense budget. Around $245 million will be taken this time. It's already the second deduction from the Defense Ministry's budget this year. Around 3.6% of the 2020 defense budget will be used to combat COVID-19, but the Defense Ministry has said that such a withdrawal will not affect its ability to carry out its goals and projects. With a total of 3 extra budgets this year, the South Korean government will have poured $222 billion into providing a financial cushion from the impact of COVID-19. And that's equivalent to 14% of the country's 2020 GDP. The government will submit the budget proposal to the National Assembly on Thursday. After lawmakers' approval, the government plans to spend more than 75% of it within 3 months. 김다미, Arirang News.
Time now for an in-depth look at the market news this afternoon, and for that I'm joined on the line by Dr. Yang Jun-seok, professor of economics at the Catholic University of Korea. Professor Yang, thank you for coming on today.
Happy to be here.
Now we have the Korean government coming out with a third extra budget for the first time in about half a century. So what kind of effect do you think this extra spending will have, and what concerns might there be?
Okay, well, if you look at, first of all, the amount of the supplementary budget, and since it's all being spent this year, let's look at the total first, second, and third supplementary budget together. That's more than 50 trillion won. This is the highest supplementary budget that there has ever been, and not only with the absolute amount, but also in proportion to Korea's GDP. This is going to be about 3% of Korea's GDP. This compares to supplementary budget we had in 2009 after the global financial crisis, which was 2.36% of Korea's GDP, and after the 97 global Asian financial crisis, that in 1998, the supplementary budget was about 2.33% of Korean GDP. So both in the absolute amount and in the proportion, the 3 supplementary budgets that we're having this year will be the largest that Korea has ever seen. But still, this is less than what other countries are spending. For example, the United States, they don't call it a supplementary budget, but their Congress allowed $3 trillion in additional spending. That's about 13% of U.S. GDP. So even though this is a large amount for Korea, it's not particularly large compared to some of the other countries' increased budgets. As to the effect, well, we are just talking about the budget, but they're going to spend most of this budget on the economic plan that the Moon administration announced on Monday. That includes emergency measures to deal with the negative shock from the coronavirus, as well as the so-called Digital New Deal and the Green New Deal. I think their short-term budgeting plans, the ones that are dealing with the negative shock from coronavirus, I think they're necessary. They're relatively well thought out. But for the Digital New Deal and the Green New Deal components, we're seeing a lot of the type of policies that we've seen before in previous administrations. The effectiveness of these policies have been mixed. For example, allowing new venture capital, providing more funds to certain types of companies, providing investment incentives, and so on. Those have had mixed results in the past, so I'm a bit more worried about the Digital New Deal and the Green New Deal component. And then finally, the additional supplementary budget will probably increase Korea's debt-GDP ratio to about 43-44% of the GDP. That, I think, Korea's economy can handle right now. But we will continue to have a supplementary budget probably next year. And because of the demographic changes in Korea, we will probably continue to have a lot of budget deficits in the years in the future. So we really do need to prepare to slow down, to find out ways to slow down the increases in the debt GDP ratio. But that's a project for the future rather than project for now.
Well, now elsewhere, Korea is reopening its case at the WTO against Japan's export restrictions. This, of course, is an issue related to semiconductors and Japan's restriction on key materials related to their manufacturing. So what does the reopening of this case mean to Korean companies?
Okay, well, in terms of production, it probably doesn't mean very much. Korea has been living with Japan's export restrictions, and we've done a fairly good job in adjusting to it. Korea has found alternate sources for these chemicals, and they've learned how to deal with perhaps using less pure chemicals to produce semiconductors, and developing domestic sources as well. So in terms of production, I don't think it's going to affect Korean businesses all that much. Where it will make a difference maybe is the diplomatic front, because now Korea has leverage to try to get Japan to drop the export restriction, or at the very least, do not expand the export restrictions into other areas, other chemicals or areas outside semiconductors. Korea is still very vulnerable in some industries to Japan's export restrictions. So this WTO case can serve as a leverage to try to stop that. Also, it is not entirely clear whether Japan can win the case in the WTO. And the reason that Japan has put the export restrictions in place in the first place is try to get Korea to not sell off the assets that Korean courts had confiscated in order to pay compensations for workers who are forced to work in Japanese steel mills during the Japanese colonialization of Korea. That process right now is suspended. It isn't moving forward. So I think this will serve as a tool, a leverage to stop Japan from expanding the export restrictions. It will not affect the Korean production all that much. And also, it'll take about a year or two at the very least to get this case through the WTO. So in one sense, we're letting this problem sort of run on. Don't let it get serious. Just leave it at the point we're at right now, so that the problem doesn't get worse, and Korea can still import needed goods from Japan without worrying about further export restrictions.
All right, and we're almost out of time, though, Professor Young, but take us through the global markets. The rallies continue in Wall Street and here in Korea.
Yeah, it's almost mysterious how well the stock markets are doing, even though we're getting a lot of bad news. We are learning more and more that coronavirus will last until at least 2021, and the United States especially are dealing with riots over the death of George Floyd, a black man who was killed during police arrest, and the U.S.-China trade war seems to be getting worse, but these are not reflected in the stock markets all that much. That may be because the government and central banks of these countries are taking a lot of risks out of the stock market, and also maybe because the stock investors are irrationally exuberant, but we'll have to see whether this trend continues.
All right, Professor Young, thanks so much for your insights. We appreciate it, as always.
Thank you.
With fewer people flying these days, duty-free shops have all but shut down. To help them, the government's going to allow them to sell items domestically. Demand was so high on opening day that the first duty-free shop to go online actually crashed. Jang Tae-hyun reports.
The number of foreign visitors to South Korea fell by 43% on year in February and plunged by 95% in March due to the COVID-19 outbreak. And duty-free stores have felt the brunt of this drop in visitors. In the first quarter of this year, Lotte duty-free's profits were down 96% compared to the previous year. And the Silla and Shinsegae saw operating losses of $40 million and $26.5 million respectively. To help those firms overcome this difficult period, The Korea Customs Service will allow them to sell items that have been stocked up for more than 6 months. Shinsegae was among the first to start selling some brands online with a 10 to 50% discount this Wednesday.
People can make online reservations, pay taxes, and receive the items at home in about a week.
Lotte Duty Free will sell those items at offline stores from June 26th. Duty Free shops will sell surplus products except items like cosmetics, perfume, alcohol, and dietary supplements until October 29th. Meanwhile, the Ministry of Land, Infrastructure and Transport said Monday that airports in Korea will reduce the rent for businesses at the airport. Small and medium-sized businesses will get up to a 75% off, while larger companies can get up to 50% off. Chang Tae-hyun, Arirang News.
That brings us to the end of this newscast. Thank you for watching. More live news coming your way at 7 p.m. Korea time.